We know there's no closer in the world who could come into Baltimore this year and replace Felix Bautista and be as good as he was last season. But maybe Craig Kimbrel with his new changeup could come close. We'll talk about that coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast.
You are Locked On Orioles, your daily Baltimore Orioles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey there, Orioles fans. Today is Thursday, March 21st, 2024, and welcome back into the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Connor Newcomb. And coming up on today's episode, we're going to break down what we saw in the Orioles' once again televised spring training game on Wednesday evening when they throttled the Phillies, get a look at Craig Kimbrel, Dean Kremer, and some of the Orioles offense just mashing once again in spring training. Then we'll talk a little bit about opening day. The Angels have named their opening day starter against the Orioles, so we'll chat about what could this O's lineup look like on opening day. And finally, some Orioles news and notes to finish off the pod. But that's all coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast. But before we get there, just did want to thank you for making Locked On Orioles your first podcast listen of the day. We're free and available on all podcast listening platforms 5 days a week, Monday through Friday throughout the season. And of course, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to the Locked On Orioles YouTube page. And remember, we are 1 week away now from opening day. We are 1 week away from the games counting for this incredibly hyped up 2024 Orioles season. And during the season, if you haven't been with this podcast during a season, here's pretty much how it looks. You get a new episode essentially at midnight after a game ends. It's recapping that night's game and then getting you any other news and analysis, opinions, mailbag questions, whatever it may be surrounding the Orioles 5 days a week. So game ends around 10 p.m. You're like, where do I go to listen to what just happened? Well, generally by midnight on audio on YouTube, you're going to have that episode. Thank you so much to the everydayers out there for sticking with me 1 week away from that season. But we did at least get a televised Orioles game on Wednesday night. Back-to-back televised games for the O's. And they actually have one today, this evening, that's also televised against the Red Sox. 3 in a row, only time it's going to happen all spring training. But Orioles and Phillies was on Masson on Wednesday evening. Orioles just another blowout spring training win. They won it 13-4, not as important as what happens kind of pitch to pitch, more so than the general final score of a spring training game. But because we did get the broadcast, now we didn't get the double whammy, the patented double whammy, the StatCast Plus broadcast. We just got the broadcast because Ed Smith Stadium, where the Orioles play, does not have the publicized TrackMan data yet. But still going to get you the 5 things you need to know from Wednesday's spring training game. The first thing is, I thought Dean Kremer looked pretty good. This will be his final spring start before we kick into the season. Now, Kramer most likely, I would think, would slot in as the Orioles' number 3 starter behind Corbin Burnes and Grayson Rodriguez to begin the season. So that probably means he pitches Sunday, March 31st. So if he's pitching on the 20th, he will likely throw some sort of simulated game or live BP early next week and try to throw 75, 80 pitches while the Orioles are done with spring training games, but getting ready for opening day to get himself set and ready to go for that start next Sunday. But in terms of in games, this was the last one, and I thought he looked good. Yeah, he did have to come out of 1 inning slightly before, he could finish it, but that's more of a spring training thing than anything else. Guys throw maybe just a bit too many pitches. You can take a guy out, put him back in. There's really no rules in spring training. But I thought the breaking stuff looked crisp. He was throwing a solid amount of strikes. He threw some nasty cutters and breaking balls. End of the day, solid final outing for Dean Kremer in spring training. Second thing you need to know from Wednesday's game is that the Orioles regulars just put on an offensive show early in this game. Anthony Santander had a 3-run homer in the first. Then Ryan O'Hearn right behind him hit a solo shot. The Orioles scored 5 runs in the first inning against Philly starter Taijuan Walker, who he's a major league starter. Like, Walker is probably going to be number 4 in the Phillies rotation coming out of opening day, and the Orioles just bludgeoned him. I mean, this was mostly a lineup of regulars that were in the game on Wednesday. Honestly, everyone but Ryan McKenna that started this game was pretty much going to be a regular for the Orioles. Mullins, Rutschman, Henderson, Santander, Mountcastle, O'Hearn, Arias, Mateo. I mean, those are major league guys. And then you had McKenna in there, but it was nice to see them blow things up. And then Gunnar Henderson in the second inning absolutely demolished a 2-run homer on a hanging breaking ball down the right field line. And then even later in the game, I mean, that was just 7 of the runs. The Orioles scored 13, like the Baby Birds were getting in on it late in this game as well. And the Orioles scored 6 more in the 7th inning when they were just pouring things on. Some of it was some pretty bad defense by the Phillies backups. But either way, just they continue to hit in spring training. Third thing you need to know from Wednesday's game is that Craig Kimbrel might have a new pitch. Now, it's good to know that Craig Kimbrel, who's been in the big leagues for almost 15 years and is going to be most likely a Hall of Fame closer, pretty much for his entire career has been fastball knuckle curve. That has been his combination, upper 90s fastball, upper 80s curveball with big break, and that's been enough for him. But he has always toyed with a changeup. He went on Foul Territory, the show that was live at Orioles camp back on Tuesday, and he talked with AJ Przinsky and Eric Kratz and Scott Braun about how he's kind of always had this changeup. He said he's been trying to throw it since he was 12 years old and just hasn't perfected it, but he's always had it. And he did say that he was looking to throw the changeup more this spring and is hoping to debut it a little bit more in 2024 with the Orioles. And it's interesting because if you dig through like I did, there's been multiple times like this where Kimbrel, you go back to 2015, he was flashing the changeup multiple times then and thinking about when he was with the Braves, like, will I throw this pitch? He did throw it a couple of times, I believe in September of that year, but he was flashing it in spring training. 2020, when he was struggling a bit, was throwing the changeup a little bit in spring training. He was trying to get himself back together, was thinking about the changeup. Like, it's always been a pitch in his back pocket. There's a good article from November of 2015 from Jeff Sullivan over at Fangraphs talking about like what Kimbrel could be if he really does throw that changeup. And I know now it's, 8+ years later, but it's still an interesting pitch. Well, he broke it out in the 5th inning when he came in and struck out the side. Kyle Schwarber, Trey Turner, Bryson Stott. Good morning, good afternoon, good night to the middle third of the Phillies lineup against his old teammates. I mean, the fastball looked awesome. The curveball looked awesome. The command was great in that inning from Kimbrel. But the final pitch he threw in that inning was a changeup that he got Stott to swing and a miss on to end the frame with a strikeout. And the pitch before, he had spiked the changeup, went back to it, and it was a beautiful front door change down and away from a left-handed hitter. Stott swings through it. It looked like it was probably around 90 miles an hour. I mean, that's going to be a disgusting pitch if Kimbrel can command it. And again, it's something he's always had in his back pocket, and he's never really debuted. Between StatCast and Brooks baseball data and research I've done, it looks like Kimbrel has been recorded as throwing somewhere around 4 total changeups in his entire, almost 15-year big league career. So he's always had it, but never really debuted it in regular season or postseason games. But maybe this is something the Orioles, went after him to replace Felix this year. And maybe they are talking with him and saying, hey, let's encourage Kimbrel to try and throw this changeup. We think it could be, it will never replace the fastball and curveball. It'll still be his number 3 pitch. But maybe you look at that and say, this is a way for him to get lefties out at a little higher rate. This is a way for him to change speeds a little bit, have something that moves away from left-handers instead of, his usual stuff, his fastball going straight and his curveball kind of moving into left-handers. It would be a great little wrinkle, even if Kimbrel throws it 2, 3, 4, 5% of the time this year, just to toss it in. If it looks as good as it did on Wednesday, that's where Craig Kimbrel could get to another level with the Orioles this year. And he's not going to be Felix, but maybe could be a little bit closer to it. Fourth thing you need to know from Wednesday's game is that, speaking of the bullpen, Yennier Cano, who should be the top setup man to Craig Kimbrel this year, really had his first tough outing of the spring, didn't finish his 7th inning, walked 3 batters. Yeah, it was, a little reminiscent of what we saw when Cano first came over to the Orioles and what he was like with the Twins. But here's the thing. That was, I believe, his 5th, 6th outing of the spring. Every other one has been flawless. He had looked great. That was the only one where he really struggled at all. The O's will most likely get him into 1 more, if not 2 more spring training games. Might try to have him pitch a back-to-back in spring training before it's all said and done. But yeah, Cano will be fine. Just didn't have the command on Wednesday. But it's good to know that, hey, he's got a bad one in there. Maybe get out of the way now and have a 0 ERA in April. I would certainly take that. And the 5th and final thing you need to know from Wednesday's spring training game is that Ryan Mountcastle returned to the Orioles lineup. Now, at the plate, he went 0 for 3 with a strikeout. That's not really what's important. What's important is that he was out there. He had not played since last Tuesday, March 12th. He was dealing with some neck stiffness. So it was out about 8 days, but He returned to the lineup, said he took live BP Tuesday, was planning on coming back Wednesday, and he did. Stayed in the game for 3 at-bats, came out, was replaced by Tyler Nevin, not because of injury, just because it was a spring training game. So hopefully that means he's feeling good, and Mountcastle is ready to hit in the middle of that Orioles lineup 1 week from now when we get to opening day. And we do know, as long as Mountcastle is healthy and the neck's not bothering him, he is going to be in the Orioles opening day lineup. And we know that because A, he's one of the Orioles' better hitters when he's healthy, and B, it's going to be a lefty on the hill against the Orioles on opening day, as the Angels have named their starter for next week's opener. We'll talk about who it is and what that could mean for the Orioles lineup in that game coming up next. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is brought to you by Amazon Fire TV. Now, this is the time to check out Amazon Fire TV because it is your destination for sports, from live games to highlights and in-depth analysis. They've got amazing viewing experiences with the smart TVs, as well as my favorite, the Fire TV Stick. Just a little device you plug into the side of your TV, gives you access to millions of movies, TV episodes, as well as free and live TV, opening weekend for baseball, college basketball tournament. Either way, you're going to want to have Fire TV. And they've also created Fire TV channels, which includes all of us at Locked On and a lot of big leagues as well. You can get March Madness, the NBA, MLB, and lots more. So check out Fire TV channels on Fire TV and Alexa devices. If you haven't checked them out, you should. Trust me on this one. To learn more, visit www.amazon.com/lockedonfiretv. And today's episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is also brought to you by FanDuel. Say goodbye to busted brackets because FanDuel lets you bet on every game of the tournament. Whether you're betting on a big upset or a 1 seed, it's time to go dancing on America's #1 sportsbook. Because right now, customers get $200 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. That's $200 to use on point spreads, money line. You can even pick who's going to win it all, and I'll let you know who I've got in my Final Four later in the episode. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and bet on college hoops until they cut down the nets. So again, we are just 1 week away from opening day. Thursday, March 28th, Oriole Park at Camden Yards. The Orioles opening the season at home for the first time since 2018. Kind of crazy. It's been 6 years since they opened up at home, but it's the first of 3 between the Orioles and the Angels, a 3:05 p.m. Eastern time first pitch. And we've known for a while now, the Orioles announced a couple of weeks ago that Corbin Burns, who they acquired this offseason to be their ace, would be the opening day starter. That was never really a question, especially once we knew that Kyle Bradish had gone down and wouldn't be ready for opening day. Slam dunk Corbin Burns. There was more of a question on who the Angels opening day starter would be. And for a while, they were in the Blake Snell sweepstakes. We thought maybe it could be him. Of course, Snell ends up signing with the Giants on a 2-year deal. So now you go to one of the next lefties in the pecking order. And that's something I've been talking about this offseason on the podcast. Like, there was a good chance the Orioles could see 3 lefties from the Angels to begin the year. Now it's less likely because they didn't get Snell, but they're going to see at least 2 lefties, you would think. And one of them is going to be left-hander Patrick Sandoval, who was announced on Tuesday that he will be the Angels opening day starter against the Orioles next Thursday. I wanted to talk about it a little bit because it does switch up kind of how the Orioles opening day lineup could look. Now, Sandoval himself, he's such an up and down pitcher. Like, the stuff is there for him to be really good. He just still hasn't put it all together. Last year, he made 28 starts. He struggled to go deep into games, threw about 145 innings, had a 4.11 ERA, 20% K rate, 11% walk rate. Just wasn't an amazing season for Sandoval. He made 1 start against the Orioles. It was in Anaheim on September 6th, and the O's got to him for 7 runs over 5 innings, although only 4 were earned on 7 hits, 3 strikeouts, and 4 walks for Sandoval that day against the Orioles offense. That was like a 10-12-1 Orioles win that night, late night over on the West Coast. But he's kind of a pitch mix guy. He basically throws 3 main pitches and splits them evenly. 26% of his pitches are sliders, 26% are changeups, and 26% are four-seam fastballs. He sprinkles in, curveballs and sinkers and sweepers here and there to kind of round out his pitch mix. But generally, it's slider, changeup, fastball, pretty mix. The sliders to the lefties, the changeup from Sandoval is elite to righties. It's a 43% whiff rate on that pitch. That's how he's able to remain a major league starter. But the big part here for Sandoval is he is a left-hander, and the Orioles have a lot of left-handed hitters that are going to be on this roster. It's something I've talked about multiple times this offseason and talked about, what would the O's do against lefties this year? And this is all still TBA because we don't know who those 13 hitters are going to be that the O's are going to take north to Baltimore on the opening day roster. And whether or not Jackson Holliday is on the roster makes a big difference here. But if we're assuming my projections are right, which who says they're going to be? I've been wrong a lot. Been right some. Been wrong a lot. My projection for the Orioles hitters that make the team, the 2 catchers, Rutschman and McCann, the 7 infielders, Mountcastle, O'Hearn, Westberg, Arias, Mateo, Henderson, and Holliday, and then the 4 outfielders being Hayes, Mullins, Santander, and Colton Cowser. That would most likely give me a lineup that looks like this on opening day against the left-hander Sandoval. Adley Rutschman hitting leadoff and catching. Now, this is something the Orioles did at times last year against lefties. They had Adley hit leadoff overall. Brandon Hyde at one point said he didn't like Adley doing it at home because he didn't have enough time to get the catcher's gear off after catching the first inning and get ready to hit because of the pitch clock. Not only that, but the clock in between innings now. But I think it's something they could do on opening day. Then something they've done really late last year when they got him back was Ryan Mountcastle would hit second against lefties because he's just been so dominant against left-handers. So he would play first base and hit second. Anthony Santander just slotted right in there in the 3-hole playing right field. Then you got Gunnar Henderson hitting fourth and playing third base. That's generally what he had done last year against righties, leading off or hitting second. And then against lefties, he still has struggled against lefties. So the O's move him down in the order a little bit and hit him fourth. Then you'd have Austin Hayes, certainly going to be in there against a left-hander, playing left field and hitting fifth. As long as he's good for opening day, he should be, but we'll talk about that coming up in a little bit. Then I would think you slot in Cedric Mullins there, hitting sixth and playing center field. Mullins, I don't think he's going to be in a platoon. And honestly, his splits were pretty even between righties and lefties last year. There was more of a big-time split in 2022. But he's still, even if he does regain at some point this year that leadoff spot, which could happen, it'll probably be only against righties and not against lefties. So you have Mullins down there hitting sixth. Then, of course, against the lefty, you got Jordan Westberg in there. I have him playing second base and hitting seventh. And then with the lefty out there, at least for now, I think Jorge Mateo is going to start against lefties. And at this point, I'd put him at shortstop. So I'd hit Jorge Mateo ninth and playing shortstop. So you're basically just left with who's going to be your DH and hit eighth. And your options at this point are a righty in Ramon Arias, who is actually a reverse splits guy and is much worse against lefties, so it probably wouldn't be him. A righty in James McCann, who historically in his career has hit lefties pretty well, but last year didn't really happen, and the O's early in the season used him as a catcher against lefties and put him in there against left-handed hitters, even DH'd him some against left-handed pitching. Don't see that happening this year. They just have too many good hitters. So it basically leaves you with 3 left-handed options on the roster to take that DH spot against a lefty. It is Colton Cowser, it is Ryan O'Hearn, and it is Jackson Holliday. And to me, you could maybe argue for O'Hearn because, he had the biggest impact in the best season last year. So you can kind of give him the role on opening day. But the Orioles really hid him. He had like 20 plate appearances total against left-handers last year. They hit him against lefties. That was one of the big reasons why O'Hearn had so much success after all of his failures in Kansas City. So I think the O's will kind of continue to hide him against lefties, which tells me, listen, if Jackson Holliday is going to make this opening day roster, which is not a guarantee, but I'm projecting he will, you'd have to think to drum up the excitement. And if the O's think he's one of their best 13 hitters, no matter what, they're going to put him in the opening day lineup. So the best way to kind of pull some of that pressure off is say, okay, we are facing a lefty, which Holliday is a left-handed hitter. Maybe the O's want to hide him from some lefties early in his career. They're certainly going to do it. But at least for opening day, let's say, hey, let's pull the pressure off. We'll DH you, right? You don't have to worry about playing the field because we'll have Mateo in the infield. We'll have Henderson. We'll have Westberg in the infield. And we'll hit you eighth. You can hit between Westberg and Mateo, hit eighth in the order. No giant pressure on you to produce at the top of the order. I think that's what it would look like. Holliday eighth DHing and Mateo ninth at shortstop on opening day against a lefty. But we shall see what this roster and what this lineup looks like. We don't have the news on who's going to make this roster yet, although Brandon Hyde did say today that he knows that Gunnar Henderson and Adley Rutschman will definitely be on the opening day roster. Thanks for that one, Brandon. But we did get some news that could impact who is on this opening day roster, and that I'm going to get to finish off the pod coming up next. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is also brought to you by Prize Picks. Now, football season, it might be over, but the action on the floor is heating up. So whether it's tournament season or the fight for playoff home court, there's no shortage of high-stakes basketball moments this time of year. And you can get in on the excitement with Prize Picks, America's #1 fantasy sports app. How does it work? Well, you just look at a stat line for any player. So we've got the NCAA Tournament going all day today. On the men's side, 16 games. You can look at any of the games, any of the players. It'll have a total for rebounds, for assists, for points, for all three combined. You just pick more or less. Prize Picks sets the number. You just say more or less, and then hope you bring in the cash. So download the app today and use code LOCKEDONMLB for a first deposit match up to $100. Again, download the Prize Picks app, use code LOCKEDONMLB, and get a first deposit match up to $100 at Prize Picks. Pick more, pick less. It's that easy. So a few pieces of Orioles news and notes just to finish off today's episode. I want to start with Austin Hays, who is still not played in a game for the Orioles. It's been about a week now. I believe it was last Thursday, March 14th, was the last time Hays appeared in a spring training game. And the notes continue to be, in Rockabako of Masson and others reporting this on Wednesday, it was a stomach bug for Austin Hays. We had heard a couple of days ago he was just under the weather. Now we know it was a stomach bug that he is still, sounds like, a little bit dealing with, but is out the other end somewhat, is kind of on the upswing here with this. Hays said he is hoping to get into the spring training game on Friday. That is his goal right now. But he also did say, he needs to gain some weight back. So this must have taken a little bit out of him. Because we are still a week out from opening day, and if Hays has finally set a date like, hey, my goal is to play Friday, even if that gets pushed back to Saturday or Sunday, you would think if it is just the stomach bug, he's on the upswing, he should be plenty good to go for opening day. If for some reason he's not, he just feels like his body hasn't rebounded, or whatever it is, obviously number one thing is Colton Cowser is automatically on this roster. And then if it is just going to be like a 10-day IL stint, the O's probably just roster Ryan McKenna to have a good defensive right-handed hitting outfielder to replace Hays for 10 days. And then when Hays is ready to go, they bring him back and just DFA McKenna. That's probably what they would do. But it seems like Hays, along with Mountcastle, who returned on Wednesday, are going to be good to go for opening day. But that stomach bug, that's not stuff to mess around with. That is tough. So hopefully he gets all better and is good to go. And hopefully does return 2 spring training games on Friday. Now, the Orioles did cut one more player out of big league camp. They're still down to 45. They still need to cut 19 more out of big league camp. And it was Nick Vespi who was sent down on Wednesday. He was optioned to AAA and to minor league camp, so we know he will start the year in the Norfolk Tides bullpen. Not a big surprise. Vespi was certainly part of this battle for one of those final opening day bullpen spots for the Orioles, but he still has one option year remaining. This is his final year with options. And basically, it's going to be the same thing for Vespi that it was in 2022 and that it was in 2023. He is going to pitch with the Orioles multiple different stints out of the bullpen. He's never going to be like a go-to setup man, but they're going to use him at times. He's going to go up and down, and they're probably going to exhaust all 5 options you have in one season like they did the last 2 years. It's just most likely going to happen with Vespi in his final option year. He's going to be up and down. Maybe he'll get a big enough chance this year with a few more openings in the pen that if he strings together 3 or 4 good appearances in the majors, he can stick for longer than he has the last couple of years. That's certainly a possibility, but he's going to be that Norfolk shuttle up-down guy this year. And he showed last year he can provide more length, had multiple appearances of 2 innings or more out of the Orioles bullpen. That's something nice to see. That gives him a little more value. Really, next offseason, this time next year, is we're going to have the real Nick Vespi conversations, because in spring training 25, going into opening day, he'll be out of options, and the O's will have to DFA him to not put him on the roster. But right now, it just makes their decisions easier to go to AAA. Again, he will pitch for the Orioles at some point this season. Was never really projecting him to make the opening day bullpen. I will say who I have right now, it's always been my locks of Craig Kimbrel, Yennier Cano, Danny Coulombe, and Cionel Perez. I've thrown Dylan Tate as my 5th lock. Mike Baumann is not a lock, but he is a 98% for me right now as that 6th guy. And honestly, above 60% at this point is Keegan Aiken. He's had a good spring, and Brandon Hyde has just talked him up multiple times this spring. I would think he'll be the third lefty in the pen to replace DL Hall. Can't replace his production, but to get another lefty out there. I'm still kind of at a loss at who's going to get that eighth and final bullpen spot. I don't know if they feel like they'll need a long reliever because, again, the Orioles, with so many off days, like technically could go with only 4 starters for the first couple weeks of the year. So I don't know if they would roster Julio Teheran or Albert Suarez as a long guy. So I'm thinking what they might just do is keep Jacob Webb as the final reliever. You know, it wasn't a great end to his year in the postseason last year, hasn't had an amazing spring training, did throw a scoreless outing against AAA hitters on Wednesday. But because Webb is the only other guy who is, you know, on the 40-man roster and is out of options, that kind of just would make him the decision to make it easier, keep him around for a month and see how he does, and then make another decision. He's still a big league caliber reliever. It's just a question of, is he the Webb the Orioles had the first 6 weeks when he came over from the Angels, or is he the Webb that kind of showed up right at the end of the year last year? We shall see, but I think Jacob Webb at this point has the inside track for that final bullpen spot. Now, that was about 26 minutes. I hope I did well talking about the Orioles because it hasn't been the Orioles that have been completely on my mind. I got to say, we're not going to get too much into this, but the Shohei Otani and Ippei, his interpreter, story that broke on Wednesday has just been completely filling up my brain since we got the story. If you haven't seen it yet, the LA Times broke the story on Wednesday. There's also a good story from Jeff Passan in ESPN. There's a good story in The Athletic about it as well already. Essentially, the short of it is Shohei Otani's translator and great friend Ippei, who's been with him for 10, 15 years and came over with him, was employed by the Angels and is now employed by the Dodgers. He, who was in South Korea on Wednesday when the Dodgers beat the Padres to open up the Seoul series and open up the 2024 MLB season, he was seen in the dugout chatting with Shohei. Shortly after the game, he was fired by the Dodgers. And apparently, he had over $4 million in gambling debts that he had initially said Shohei Otani had basically wired the money to pay off the gambling debts for Ippei. And he was using an illegal bookie in California because California is one of the states where sports gambling is still illegal. Then Shohei Otani's lawyers kind of flipped the story and said, no. We are accusing Ippei of apparently stealing this $4+ million from Shohei Otani and using it to cover his gambling debts. We're still not sure where the story is going to go, but this is already #1 sports scandal of the year. It might be the sports scandal of the year, and we're only in March. It is going to be very interesting to see how this plays out, but that has kind of been occupying my brain for a while now. I mean, there's a lot of thoughts I have about sports gambling, about the legalization of it. I know I talk about it on this show. It's multiple of our sponsors as well. I understand that, but I am very intrigued to see how this entire story with maybe one of the most famous athletes in the world, certainly the most famous baseball player right now with this new contract with the Dodgers, how this all plays out. Just an insane story to follow. But I guess the only other thing taking up some space in my brain sports-wise right now is the men's NCAA tournament starts today. One of the greatest days in all of sports is today. First day of the tournament, 16 games. Settle in, watch some basketball. And if you're a fan, let me know in the YouTube comments right now. Give me your Final Four for the men's and the women's tournament. I made my brackets on Wednesday. My Final Four on the men's side, I've got Auburn, New Mexico, Tennessee, and Houston, with Tennessee beating Auburn in the national championship game. And then on the women's side, I've got Tennessee as well. I think it's going to be a big March for the Volunteers. I've got Tennessee, I've got South Carolina, and I've got LSU in there along with USC. And I've got Angel Reese and LSU repeating with a win over undefeated South Carolina in the championship game. So let me know in the comments, Final Four picks for the men's and women's tournaments, and enjoy some basketball and some baseball over the next couple of days. I'll be back with you tomorrow for one more episode of the week. We will recap another televised Orioles spring training game on Thursday evening and get you any more news, notes, and analysis you need as we creep closer and closer to opening day. But until then, I'm Connor Newcomb, and this has been the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.